How to give 2 weeks' notice the right way. It is not uncommon for employees to change jobs. When this happens, the question frequently arises regarding whether employees are legally obligated to provide 2 weeks' notice before quitting their current job. The short answer is no. Is it illegal to quit a job without notice? Is there a give 2 weeks' notice law in my state? There are no federal or state 2-week notice laws that require an employee to provide 2 weeks' notice to his or her employer before quitting. Most states have adopted the at-will doctrine, which is a common law doctrine that defines most employment relationships. Excluding exceptions, the at-will doctrine gives an employer the right to terminate an employee at any time, without cause or any reason. Likewise, employees are also allowed to leave their employment at any time and without a reason. In other words, there is no 2-week notice law and no mandatory notice period in the U.S. The employee's notice period is not set by any law, and you are free to quit at any time. Since there is no 2-week notice law, you may leave your place of employment without any job notice. However, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Despite not being a legal requirement, some employers may have company policies requiring their employees to give 2 weeks' notice. Although an employee is generally not required to comply with the policy, many employers penalize employees who do not, where permissible under state law. Such penalties may include forfeiting accrued vacation leave or other benefits. Employers may also encourage employees to give a 2 weeks' notice by offering severance pay. What if you give 2 weeks' notice and they ask you to leave? Since there are no 2 weeks' notice laws, employees are not required to give employers any notice prior to leaving their job. Likewise, employers are not required to accept a 2 weeks' notice and may release employees from their position immediately, although this may make the employees eligible for unemployment when they would not have been otherwise. What about employment contracts? Employment contracts fall under the at-will exception. Generally speaking, employment contracts do not secure indefinite employment. However, an employment contract typically includes procedures for terminating the employment contract. This means, if the terms within the contract require 2 weeks' notice, the employee has a binding legal obligation to give the notice. There may be circumstances, however, when the employer and employee may mutually agree to modify or disregard any notice requirements. Each state may have specific laws related to employment contracts. Therefore, to address the legalities of employment separation, it may be necessary to consult an attorney who specializes in employment law. How much notice to give when leaving a job? From an employee's perspective, giving 2 weeks' notice is an act of courtesy. It allows the employer to find a replacement and to make a smoother transition to the new employee. It is a myth that employees are required to give their employers 2 weeks' notice before quitting. It is simply a matter of choice in most instances. Giving notice may also help preserve a professional relationship between the employer and the former employee. Sometimes, although not required, the act of courtesy is rewarded with a positive employer recommendation in the future. In addition, it encourages a positive professional relationship, which may leave the door open for future employment if the employer chooses. Although there are no labor laws regarding 2 weeks' notice, it's always wise to give proper notice to your employer. Don't burn your bridges, as the saying goes. 2 weeks' notice is a courtesy you give to your employer by notifying them 2 weeks ahead of time that you plan to leave your job. Giving 2 weeks' notice is standard practice when resigning. If there is some emergency and you are not able to give your employer proper notice, just try to give them as much time as you can. Giving 1 week notice instead of 2 is certainly better than nothing. Remember, your employer might be dealing with their own emergency once they find out they are short on staff. What is 2 weeks' notice? 2 weeks' notice is a courtesy that gives your employer time to prepare for your resignation and get a head start on hiring someone else. If your employer asks you to stay longer than 2 weeks, or the time period in your contract, you can choose to do so, but you have no obligation to stay unless you have an employment contract that stipulates otherwise. Your employer does not have to accept your 2 weeks' notice, unless it's in your contract, and can end your employment immediately. Therefore, be prepared to leave your job as soon as you give notice. Make sure that you have all the information you need from your work computer and any other information you want to take with you, ready to go. How does 2 weeks' notice work? Leaving a position can feel uncomfortable, but if you follow a few simple rules, the process should go smoothly. Quitting without notice is almost always a bad idea for several reasons, so be sure to plan this properly. Tell your boss first. Start by providing your notice to your boss. It may be tempting to avoid a face-to-face conversation, but whenever possible, it's best to give notice in person. It's up to you how many details you want to share about why you're leaving. At the end of the conversation, it's appropriate to shake hands. Next, you will likely want to tell mentors, people you work with closely, and coworker friends. At a certain point, your manager will tell your whole team. Prepare a transition plan. While it is possible that when you give your notice, the company will immediately terminate your employment, it's also quite likely you'll wind up working for 2 more weeks. Managers and coworkers will likely be eager to get caught up on your various projects. Have a transition plan prepared to make your departure seamless. Be respectful. Even if you despise your job or coworkers or didn't believe in the company's mission, now is not the time to share negative opinions. When you're giving notice, try to focus on the positive things about your time working together or how much you've learned from being at the company. If you cannot sincerely say anything nice, follow the old adage and don't say anything at all. Make plans to keep in touch. Use your 2 weeks' notice to add people on LinkedIn and other social media accounts, and make certain that coworkers have your personal email. Make future communications easy. That way, if you ever need a recommendation or referral, you can easily get in touch. In many cases, employees will want to document or formalize their resignation in a letter. Or, you may prefer to write your resignation in an email. What happens after you give your notice? Generally, the 2-week period is one of transition. You may have lots of meetings with coworkers to review the status of projects and walk through your day-to-day routine and tasks. You may be asked to prepare documents, email clients to introduce a new contact at the company, or share where you keep important files. Do your part to ensure that everyone who should know that you're departing the company is properly informed. It can be tempting to slack off during this period, but resist the urge. Just as you worked hard to make a good first impression during interviews, it's also important to make a strong last impression on your way out of the job. This will help ensure that colleagues and managers think of you positively, which will come in handy if you ever need a recommendation or if you work together in the future. When you need to resign right away, under normal circumstances, providing 2 weeks' notice is standard practice. However, there may be times when you just can't stay that long. Whether it's because of issues at work or personal circumstances, you may need to move on immediately. Resigning without a 2-week notice might be necessary for a number of reasons, such as you've been asked to do something illegal, your employer is withholding wages, you've been the victim of harassment or abuse. If that's the case, it's still a good idea to stay professional in your dealings with the company. Talk to your human resources department and have a support system in place as you leave your job. Tips for writing a resignation letter. With 2 weeks' notice, use business letter format. Use a business letter format so that your letter looks professional. At the top of your letter, include your contact information, the date, and your employer's contact information. State the date. The most important thing you need to say in your letter is when you will be leaving the company. You can either state the specific date you will leave, or say that you are leaving 2 weeks from the current date. Keep it short. You don't need to include any more information than the fact you are leaving and when your last day of work will be. Consider saying thank you. If you wish, you can also include a thank you for the opportunity provided and the experience you gained while working with the company. Be positive. As with all resignation letters, brevity is advantageous, and it's best to avoid mentioning anything negative about your employer or coworkers. Maintain professionalism with everyone always. You never know whose path may cross yours in the future. Offer to help. Consider offering to help with the transition process. You might offer something specific, such as helping to train a new employee, or you can just offer your general help. Send the letter to the right people. Send this letter to both your employer and to your Human Resources (HR) office, so that HR has a copy on file. Consider a resignation email. You can also send a resignation email message rather than a formal letter. The content of the email will be similar to a letter,